Horror ghost stories, ghost with long breasts. Author, Lu T. Hoa. In 1992, my family had a new member, Ngan. All habits and positions in the family changed clearly. I, from being the most pampered child in the family, now have to give up everything I have for him. Giving in to my parents, my place to sleep, or even my mother's nipples. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I was weaned, but had to touch my mother's nipples to sleep. That day I hated Ngan so much. Because of her appearance, I lost everything. Even though I hated him, having to witness my parents happily watching him roll over, then clapping and encouraging him when he learned to stick his butt up, made me see how ridiculous this life is. But I don't understand why I hate it so much that I can handle any action from it skillfully. For example, if he puts his hand in his mouth and sucks, I know I have to run to get a towel to wipe it. Or if he peed and pooped, I knew I had to run into the room to find some curtain fabric so Mom could change it for him. I still tolerate it except for the fact that it cries. That day was summer, although it was still hot, but the sun had cooled down. It was probably around 4 p.m. I had to stay home to take care of Ngan, so my mother could go to the commune to receive rice from the women's union. My father went to work as a construction assistant, and my brother hasn't returned from school yet. My mother told me very carefully, "Watch her carefully, don't let her climb on the bed and onto the chair and fall upside down on the ground." If I cry, I run to the bed in the room to get the shirt my mother is warming in rice water and put it on for me. Let me see the smell of my mother and the smell of rice water so I won't cry anymore. Mom is going to the commune for a bit and will be right back. Before leaving, my mother spread a tattered mat on the dirt floor, placed Ngan in the middle of the mat, then locked the door and left. As soon as my mother reached the end of the alley, Ngan strained her body and pushed, her face red and screaming. No matter how much I coaxed her, she wouldn't stop. I was so scared. I was panicking and didn't know what to do when I suddenly remembered my mother's instructions. I ran into the room, climbed onto the bed, flipped open the curtain covered with patches, and looked for the shirt my mother told me to wear. Apparently, before leaving, my mother said to leave it on the bed, but now I can't find it. While I was searching, I heard my mother's sad lullaby and realized that Ngan was no longer crying. I knew my mother would come home, but I didn't expect her to come home so quickly. I jumped out of bed and ran out happily shouting, "Mom is back!" But it seems not to be, the door is still closed. Looking around the house to look for Ngan, I was startled when I saw her standing on the bed, holding her hands on the window bars and poking her beak out. Outside the window there was a strange woman with long hair that covered most of her face and her head tilted to one side. Every few seconds, she would raise her flabby hand with long, dirty claws to hold the head neatly, but as soon as she let go, the head would fall back to its original position. She wore brown clothes like the one in the temple, but opened them up, revealing her long breasts that reached nearly her navel. His dark gray skin looked very scary. She reached into the window bar, hugged Ngan's head and caressed it, her mouth emitting a sound as if she were singing a lullaby to her baby. As for Ngan, she puckered her mouth and sucked on the woman's nipple. Seeing that scene, I cried out of fear. Hearing me cry, she put her finger to her mouth to signal me to be quiet and then brought me closer to the window where she and Ngan were standing. Outside the window, there are still a few rays of sunlight shining down on the back garden. The wind was still blowing gently, making the kumquat trees shake slightly. She grinned, revealing sharp black teeth. Seeing that scene, I innocently ran to the door, grabbed a broom and shouted, "Will you let my brother go? If not, I will beat you." Hearing me say that, she didn't seem scared. With one hand, she still held Ngan's head and caressed it against her chest. With the other hand, she held the remaining long, plump breast and brought it towards me and said, "Are you hungry? Can you give me something to drink?" I shouted. She let my brother go. She dropped her breast and raised her hand to signal me to be quiet again. She put her hand out the window, hooked it into the pocket of the shirt she was wearing, then opened her hand full of candy and waved it towards me. "Do you want candy? Auntie, give it to me." Seeing colorful candies, I really like it. But I have no intention of compromising with her. I just intended to walk a little closer to the bed to see the candies clearly. I don't know where the candy is, but it seems like it is growing on my fragile hand as if it had been soaked in water for a long time. That hand, no exaggeration, looks like a devil's hand. The candy was filled in the palm of his hand and then spilled out and fell all over the bed. At this point, I couldn't resist anymore. I quickly climbed onto the bed, picked up all the candy, stuffed it into my mouth, and chewed greedily. While chewing, I glanced up and peeked at her scary face that was completely twisted to one side, as if to prevent anything unexpected from happening. Her face was blank, running straight from her forehead down to her nose and mouth. She has no eyes. As for Ngan, he really hates looking at her right now. The stupid face can't tell which is the mother and which is the stranger. Just stick your mouth out and suck passionately. Just then, my mother's voice rang out from the yard. "Are my pieces of gold and silver at home good?" Hearing her mother's voice, she walked away from the window. His gait looked extremely painful and strange. His feet were crooked but did not touch the ground. Instead, she flipped onto her back to expose her entire belly and breasts, then used her hands to push herself against the ground and crawled, her hair falling all over the ground. As she walked, she pulled her breasts out from behind the door, but the breasts grew longer and longer and then disappeared without knowing it. As soon as she disappeared, Ngan cried again. My mother rushed to the door, unlocked it, and spoke loudly. It's Mom, I love you." After opening the door, my mother didn't rush to go straight to the bed where Ngan and I were. Mom walked over to the pillar of the house, hung the key on it, then walked back to us. But as soon as she raised her face to see me, my mother screamed loudly. "Tao, what are you eating? Oh my God, all the land is land. Who told you to eat this?" At this point I looked down at my hands. The colorful candies just now were now all dirt. My mouth cracked and jagged with grit inside. I put my hand deep into my mouth and spit out the dirt while wiping it until my tongue burned. My mother held my shoulders and shook me vigorously and asked, "What is wrong with you, Tao? Why are you eating dirt?" At this time, I was still confused about how candy could turn into soil, but when my mother hurt me, I was really scared. I screamed and cried, pointing out the window. "Mrs. Long-breasted lady." My mother just brushed the dirt off the bed and turned to look at me and asked the same question over and over again. "Why do you eat dirt? Who told you to eat?" I could only shake my head and scream and cry. That night my whole family was full. My mother told the story to my father. My father hugged me and sat on his lap and asked, "Tell me, Dad, my piece of gold, why do you eat dirt?" There was a lady standing outside the window giving me candy and then feeding Ngan a little more. My father didn't ask anything more, turned around and looked at my mother, signaling that he knew something. Right after that, my father carried me and my mother carried Ngan and walked over to Mrs. Forgot's house to ask about it. Because according to her father's theory, Forget is the oldest person in the village, so she probably knows something. As expected, she did not disappoint Dad. Right after listening to the story, she turned to me and asked a few questions and then nodded and said, "This story was also told to me by my father." Long-breast ghost. She said slowly, "In ancient times, in a certain land, there was a very rich family, but famous for being extremely cruel. This family has only one son who is over 40 years old. He has been married to 8 wives, but has not been able to give birth to a grandson to continue the family line, making the mother very impatient. Everywhere she went, she looked at other people's daughters to see if they could give birth to a grandchild for her family. But all 8 times she made the wrong choice. She heard rumors that there was a very good teacher in the neighboring province. This teacher specializes in feng shui horoscopes, not some kind of fake teacher. Hearing that, she personally packed her bags and went to the teacher's house to ask for instructions. After meeting and hearing the teacher's explanation, she happily went home to wait for the full moon night, clicked on time with her son and a few other people, and headed straight to the fields at 9 o'clock. True to his teacher's words, after walking about 2 kilometers, he met a girl looking for crabs and snails under the bright full moonlight. She ordered the people to arrest the girl and take her home. When he came home and saw the ugly, ragged, and dirty girl, he was so scared that he decided not to do anything. She was different, she thought about what the teacher said. If it weren't for that girl, no one would have given birth to a grandson for my family. She coaxed him. "Son, just a little bit and it's over. If it gives birth to a child, we keep the child and keep our grandchildren, but that kind of thing is thrown away to the dogs and the dogs don't want it. I will try my best for you." Seeing that he seemed to be agreeable, she ordered the resident to drag the girl downstairs to take a shower even though the girl tried to resist. After bathing, they took her to his room. 2 people held his hands, 2 people held his legs for him to do, then threw her arms and legs into the corner of the kitchen. The girl cried in pain and begged, but the more she begged, the more painfully she was beaten, so she had to grit her teeth and endure it with him every day. Everything only stopped when the healer announced that she was pregnant. Since being arrested, she hasn't had to do anything. Her feet were chained, she just had to sit and wait for someone to bring her food. She tried to get used to asking a few people, but no one dared to answer. She did not understand what was happening to her, she only knew that in her belly there was a baby growing every day. She took that as her only motivation to continue living in this world. Time passed quickly, and the day the baby was born came. She cried in pain as if 1,000 ribs were broken at the same time. With motherly instincts and the midwife's guidance, the baby finally cried and was born. As soon as she heard her baby cry, she smiled and then passed away. When she woke up, she found herself lying next to a temple next to the river. She was confused and extremely painful when she lost her intestines. She used the little strength she had left to slowly walk to find her child. Whenever she saw a house, she rushed in to ask people about the baby. People asked her, "Is the baby a boy or a girl?" She shook her head not knowing. That night, the milk came in and soaked her brown shirt. The engorged milk caused her pain as she walked and milked and cried. "Son, where are you? Are you hungry?" Just when she heard the sound of a child crying, she tried to lean over the wall and look at where the crying was coming from. She recognized the familiar kitchen where she was locked. She happily ran back and knocked on the door. "Open the door for me, I'll breastfeed my baby." After a while of banging on the door and shouting, she was chased away by a group of people holding sticks. She was in so much pain that she climbed up the tall neem tree in the back garden of her grandmother's house, hiding and peeking at her child. The baby seemed to notice his mother's presence. He was sleeping soundly and screamed and cried. Seeing her child crying, she heartbrokenly leaned over and reached out her arms towards the child as if wanting to hug the baby. For a moment, she forgot she was at the top of a tall tree and she fell down. In the morning, people found her neck broken and dead, and her arms and legs broken into several pieces. The people took pity on her and buried her near the base of a neem tree so that she could have the opportunity to watch her child grow up every day. After she died, everyone in the house was very scared. People whispered stories about seeing a long-haired female ghost being teased, standing by the window where the baby was lying. He kept holding the breast, stretching it out, and then putting it into the baby's mouth. The crying baby saw a nipple, sucked it, and slept soundly. Some people said they heard a sad lullaby at night. When they got up to look, they saw the ancient ghost caressing and lulling the baby to sleep. When she heard the story, she was very curious, so she took a look. She was frightened when she saw the ghost standing by the window pulling her breast out and stuffing it into her grandson's mouth. That night, she did not sleep and waited for morning to send someone from a neighboring province to invite him to his house for an important matter. After a trip to her house, the teacher said, "I advise you to rebury her as soon as possible. Cut the skin off the soles of her feet and sew them on her eyes so she can't see her way back to find her child. Then take your real grandson and go somewhere else to live, otherwise she will come back and take the baby away." Hearing what the teacher said, she forced the group of people to do as the teacher said. After reburying the body, flies and insects ate most of her face. They used a knife to cut the remaining skin on the soles of her feet, covered her eyes, and sewed them up. After that time, her family disappeared and no one knows where she went. All I know is that the girl's soul was in pain and frantically searching for her child. But her eyes could no longer see, so whenever she heard a baby crying, she would go to caress and lovingly expose her long breast to feed. After listening to the story Mrs. Forgot told, my family walked home hand in hand. The whole long journey, my parents didn't say a word to each other. Perhaps in everyone at that time there was silence for the long-breasted ghost. That time was the harvest season. My mother gave me a pot of tea. Putting a big conical hat on my head, I said, "I carry water to the rapids and give it to Dad and the aunts and uncles to drink. Tell Dad, after harvesting, invite the aunts and uncles to come over for dinner." "Yes, I know. The road from my house to the field is not far, but my field is very far. Located at the far end of the village field. Furthermore, the very heavy kettle of water kept being knocked over, causing my shorts covered in banana sap to get wet on almost one side. Every time I walk a few dozen meters, or at most 100 meters, I have to stop and rest. The distance for each stop becomes shorter and shorter. About 200 meters from my field, there is a large rice tree. I sat down again and took off my big conical hat to rest near the tree. The mid-afternoon sun was very harsh. I had to squint my eyes because of the bright sunlight. Sweat poured out, causing hair to stick to his face. I sat panting and looked out at the bright yellow field of ripe rice. In the distance, there were a few people bobbing up and down to reap. The smell of new rice mixed with the faint scent of grass straw is very pleasant. While looking far away at my home field to gain motivation to continue, in the distance on my left, something was approaching. I called it an object because it didn't look like a human or anything, and also because at that time I couldn't see clearly because of the bright sunlight shining into my eyes. The closer he got, the more clearly the human face appeared, but his gait was strange, like that of an animal. Put both arms and legs back on the ground to face your dark belly, with two long breasts hanging down on both sides. Her two long, plump breasts kept dragging on the grass. The belly and breasts are facing up to the sky, but the face is in a downward position. The closer I got, the more I realized it was the long-breasted ghost I had seen at my window nearly a year ago. I put my hands to my mouth and held my breath. Perhaps because it didn't have eyes, the ghost didn't know I was there. It just aimed straight and past me. Everything would be fine if that breast that was being dragged around like a worm didn't touch my leg. "Asian!" I shouted loudly. As soon as she heard the scream, she turned around and looked straight at me. Then she walked back and put her hand on the ground to grope for the base of the rice tree. I was so scared that my arms and legs were shaking and I couldn't move. Just then her hand grabbed my shoulder. As soon as she touched me, she said close to my ear, "Are you hungry? Please give me something to drink." As she spoke, she put her hand on the ground, waved it back and forth, found her breast and stuffed it into my mouth. I cried and shook my head vigorously. She pressed her nipple, which was crawling with flies, even closer to my face, then put her bulging hand on my mouth, squeezed it, and said, "Good boy, open your mouth and suck." I kept my mouth shut and shook my head. Her face was pressed against mine. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of mud made me gag. I quickly stood up and ran while crying. I was lucky to meet Mrs. Sun, Mr. Tang, who was carrying rice back. "What are you doing running like a ghost?" "You, the long-breasted ghost." I pointed at the base of the rice tree, but couldn't see her anymore. Uncle Tang saw that and shook his head, laughed and said I was nonsense, then pushed the cart and continued walking. I cried and ran to my father. When he saw me, he asked, "With such a hot sun, why don't you wear a hat? Why did you tell me to bring water out here for Dad, but you came away empty-handed?" I couldn't answer anything and ran straight to hug my dad. The aunts and uncles who harvest for my family laughed and said, "Dad, Tian's wonderful daughter is all grown up, but she's still so whiny." Only then did my father realize I was crying. He asked softly, "What's wrong, child? Why are you crying?" I told my father about the long-breasted ghost I had just met at the base of the rice tree. At this moment, my father lost his temper and said, "This ghost has become a ghost, but what kind of ghost can appear in broad daylight like that?" That night, everyone was eating and talking happily when Dad told the story of the long-breasted ghost to the aunts and uncles. After listening to the story, Mr. Chow said, "If the devil is afraid, he is not afraid, he is only afraid of things that become crystals. If he likes it, he will catch it and die. How do you see it?" I hear it and my arms and legs are shaking. After Mr. Chow's words, my father's face turned pale, as if afraid of something just like what he said. But my rebellious brother is different. My brother heard the story and ran over with an excited face and asked, "Did you meet the long-breasted ghost again?" "Yes." "When your parents aren't home, pretend to cry and see if it shows up." I asked my friends to hide in the room and watch for a bit. I was surprised and replied, "Are you crazy? It's so terrible I won't cry. If you don't cry, I'll make Ngan cry. I have to see her sooner or later." After saying that, my brother ran over to his friend's house to play. A few days later, my parents exchanged the harvest labor with Mr. Chow's family. That night my parents took Ngan with them and didn't eat at home. My brother's name is Kwang, born in 1984, he is about 10 years old now. It seemed like the plan had already been planned, just waiting for a convenient opportunity to carry it out. So as soon as my brother heard that his parents weren't having dinner at home tonight, he was very happy. At around 6:30 p.m., four friends and my brother arranged to meet at my house. The atmosphere was filled with chaos, each person saying something like a market. All 5 people quietly gave their unanimous opinion and then went into planning. I sat on the bed listening to the conversation, but didn't understand what my brother and his friends were thinking. So this is what I mean. When the ghost appears, we run out and hold the image of God right in its face, and it runs away into the sky. The whole group simultaneously clapped to encourage each other's spirit when God was there to protect them, and then signaled to start implementing the plan. My brother ran to me and said, "Go closer to the window and pretend to cry loudly so the ghost will appear, okay? Or not. I'm so scared." "It's because you're afraid that you have to do it. If we catch it, you won't have to see it again for the rest of your life, understand?" After listening to my brother's explanation, I found it reasonable, so I agreed to be part of the plan. My brother got into bed, opened the window, and with his friends, holding the cross with the statue of Jesus, ran into the room to wait. The space suddenly became strangely silent. Outside the window it was dark. The sound of ransomware calling to each other was loud. Occasionally, a few mice run into the kumquat trees, causing the tree branches to shake. I returned to the corner of the room to wait for my brother's signal. Under the dim light of the oil lamp, I saw my brother nodding his head signaling to begin. Just waiting for that, I screamed and cried. I don't know if it was because I was so immersed in the role, or because the dark scene outside the window made my mind think of a billion things about the long-breasted ghost that made me so scared that I cried. I sat and cried for 10 minutes, but there was no movement. My brother's friends seemed to have lost their patience in waiting. The whole group ran out of the house and said, "We failed." After that, they all left me behind and walked hand in hand to another friend's house to play. I ran in fear. "Please let me go with you. I'm very afraid of ghosts." "Your parents will be home soon. Stay home and take care of the house." Having said that, my brother cruelly left me alone to play with my friends and went to the alley and out of sight. I don't know what happened that night, but there was no moon, and in the middle of the yard were piles of straw still lying there. I looked around the yard. The ransomware was still croaking. I was so scared at this point, I quickly ran into the house and climbed into bed and closed the window. The window was designed by my father very conveniently. Just hold the 2 ends of the string tied to both ends of the door, pull lightly and then latch it and you're done. But at that time, the door was stuck with something, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the door to close. I put my tiny hand out to check what was blocking the door. Suddenly, I was startled and screamed when someone held my hand tightly. My arm outside the window jerked as hard as I could, painfully trying to escape, but I couldn't escape. I burst into tears. As soon as I heard the cry, from the roof, the long-breasted ghost crawled back down, dangling her breasts right in front of me, then continued to move slowly, poking out tufts of hair covered in mud. The gentle wind outside was enough to blow away the hair stuck in my face. I was scared and tried to free my arm, but to no avail. The upside-down head gradually swayed downwards. This scene is truly terrifying and haunting because in fact her head is attached to her neck with just a thin piece of skin, so when the head hangs down due to the force of the wind, it swings and spins, causing the piece to fall. The skin connecting her neck to her head curled up like it was about to fall off. She raised her arm to hold her head to stop it from turning. Very quickly, she reached down and hung on the window bars like a monkey swinging from a tree. She put her beady hand with black claws on my face and said, "Are you hungry? Please give me something to drink." I closed my eyes tightly and shook my head in refusal. Just then, beside Mrs. Titch's pond, there was Uncle Twan's voice calling, "Hung, get me a towel." She heard someone's voice, crawled onto the roof, made a rustling sound, and quickly disappeared. I was scared and ran out of bed, grabbed the oil lamp from the table, and rushed into the room, wrapping myself in a blanket. I was extremely scared, but didn't dare cry. A while later, my parents came home and didn't see my brother at home. His father grumbled and cursed. "This guy came here to beat me." I told him to stay home and watch me, but he disappeared like that. Dad looked at the clock hanging on the wall. "It's 8:30. After wondering, Dad walked back to the bed in the room and asked me, "Who are Mr. Kwong's friends with?" Only then did my father realize that I was trembling with fear. Dad rushed onto the bed, hugged me and shouted, "Hang, what's wrong with Tao, Grandma?" My mother ran into the room and hugged me. "Oh my God! Who stole my child's soul?" "Tao, my child." After a while of being comforted by my parents, I regained my composure. Tears flowed like rain, but I absolutely did not cry. I told my parents about my brother and his friends coming to our house to plot to catch the long-breasted ghost. After hearing the story, my father lost all composure and shouted, "Oh my God, whose son is he so stupid? She stayed at home to watch my child while looking for him. Something happened to him." After speaking, my father took the flashlight and ran quickly out the door. After Dad went looking for him, Mom was so impatient that she held Ngan to sleep while going in and out until she felt dizzy. Every few minutes, my mother would hold the oil lamp close to the clock to check what time it was. Then ask again and again, "Is it true that Mr. Kwong went with Tung and Ton's group?" I'm frustrated with the way my mother uses the same question 7 or 8 times. I didn't bother to answer anymore, but pulled a chair between the door and sat looking at the alley, waiting for news from my father and brother. The sky outside is still pitch black. Tonight it seems to be windless. Every day at this time the wind whistles the bamboo bushes on the side of the house, making them creak and creak, but today there is only the sound of the ransomware calling to each other. The jackfruit tree in front of my house has been standing there since before I was born until now. Suddenly I heard a rustling sound in the jackfruit tree, but it was too dark and there was no moon, so I couldn't see anything. Then there was the sound of someone jumping down from the jackfruit tree with a strong thud, then running past me, and then jumping to the side of the house. The sound of heavy footsteps, as if running and dragging something to the ground, rustled and then disappeared. I was so scared that I quickly ran into the house and sat down in a corner, hugging my knees. After a few minutes, Dad came back and looked at Mom and shook her head. Everyone says he's been back for a long time. I ran all the way to the church, then went a few more places, but couldn't see it anywhere. Let me go over to the house and ask Uncle Twan to help me find him. I'm just afraid it will anger people. Dad left the sentence hanging like a fire to anger Mom. What do you mean by that? He's still a little baby, and his baby teeth aren't gone yet, so who would want to take care of him? If you say that, it's like saying your child is dead. Then my mother cried. Dad saw this and was frantically trying to explain, but just then Uncle Twan came over. After listening to the story, he advised everyone to calm down. Maybe he stopped by somewhere and was busy playing and hasn't returned yet. Please calmly walk around and look for it. More and more people came to my house when they heard the news, but my brother still remained silent. Mom sat down on the porch. Whenever someone came back to look for her and shook her head to inform her that she couldn't find her, she would scream and cry. Dad is scared too. Uncle Twan was the last person to run back. I can't see you. I ran to the grave and they weren't there. Went all over the ponds and canals and looked, but didn't see anything. It's strange that it's 12 o'clock at night. Uncle Tuan's words were like a knife, cutting through all hope, making my mother sit down in tears. Seeing my mother like that, I ran and put my hand to my mouth to signal her to be quiet and said softly, "Mom, don't cry anymore. The ghost is behind the house. He heard it coming, Mom." My back garden is very large. But the path to the back of the garden is small, only about half a meter wide and slippery, so you have to stick close to the wall to walk. That was the consequence of half a year ago when my father suddenly carried a hoe to the side of the house to dig a pond. Due to overdigging, the pond was close to the house's foundation. Because of this, my parents argued every day. Mom is afraid that one day the house's foundation will collapse because it is only half a meter from the pond. In the space between the house and the pond there is a very large bamboo bush. Dad really liked this bamboo bush because it was so convenient that when digging the pond, he left some land for the bamboo to live on. Then build a pond right under the bamboo grove to keep it cool and convenient for washing and raising fish. After hearing what I said, everyone looked at each other and then simultaneously hugged the wall and went to the back of the house. Mother held an oil lamp to shine on the ground. I saw that and ran after her. As soon as I reached the bamboo base, under the flickering oil lamplight, I saw my brother sitting deep in the middle of the bamboo bush, staring at me, his mouth tightly closed with something as if he was smiling. Seeing that, I shouted, "There you are, Mom." As soon as they heard my voice, everyone rushed over and tried to pull him out. After being pulled out from the bamboo bush, his mouth was full of dirt and his cheeks were bulging. Both hands are filled with dirt. Then just put it in your mouth and add more. Dad pried open his mouth to get the dirt out, and Uncle Tuan put his hand on his face and gently patted him a few times before he woke up. Seeing the house full of people, my brother panicked and cried as he said, "I saw people looking for me. I saw Dad going in and out and Mom sitting on the porch crying. I saw Uncle Tuan holding a flashlight to look into the bamboo bush of my house. But I don't understand why I can't call out to everyone. There's something blocking my neck. How did I get in there? Full of thorns and baby snakes, aren't you afraid?" Hearing Uncle Tuan's question, my brother cried even harder. After saying goodbye to Tung, I went straight home. On the way home, passing by Bajia's longan tree, the longan tree suddenly fell towards me. At that time, I was so scared that I thought the longan tree was uprooted and fell, but it wasn't. There was something on the longan branch that looked very scary. In the dark, I couldn't see clearly, but I still recognized that she was a woman with long, loose hair and was smelly because she held me with her hand to stop me from running. Then he put his face close to the child's face and wheezed and asked, "Are you looking for Aunt? Are you hungry? Please give me something to drink." After that, it was very dirty and smelly, so I squeezed my mouth and stuffed it in. I was so scared that I tried to run away, but I tripped on a longan branch and fell down. As if he was just waiting, he grabbed the child by the scruff of his neck and pulled him away. With one hand she had to hold the dangling head, with the other she tried to pull the baby, and then her breast was dragged to the ground like a twisted worm, causing her face to grimace heavily. Seeing that, I was so scared that I fainted. When I woke up, I was sitting in the middle of a bamboo bush. But my mouth was so stiff that I couldn't call out to anyone. I only know that when I was in the bamboo bush, that creature appeared again. She put her hand to her mouth to signal her to be quiet, then climbed up on the roof and sat, swinging her long breasts hanging down. Its head seemed like it wanted to fall off and kept dangling from its neck. Its mouth was very wide and smelly, or grimy, with teeth that were yellow and black in some places. The long fingernails hang down and get in the way. I know it's very uncomfortable because of the fingernails, because every now and then, it raises its finger to stroke its hair to keep it from flying into the face, but the light touch of the long finger on the head makes it collapse. Again and again, it dangled non-stop. When Uncle Tuan walked back to the bamboo bush, under the flashlight, I saw him dangling his 2 long breasts to lure him to the roof. But just as Mr. Chow ran back, he pulled out his breast and sat on the roof until Tao saw him. Listening to my brother's story, everyone's faces turned pale with fear. At this time, Mr. Chow said, "This one is not a ghost or a demon anymore, it has become a star. It is more sublime than the devil. But maybe it was a good thing or a bad thing, now Kwang is no longer sitting here." Everyone pulled together to go home. Now there are only members left in my family. As for all the lamps, my mother filled them with oil and lit up the whole house. Only Ngan slept soundly. Early in the morning, my father sharpened his machete and then took it out to the bamboo bush to chop the knife down. As soon as the first knife hit, my father started foaming at the mouth. I was still drunk and sat on the front porch, absent-mindedly looking out at the alley. The wind blew gently, making the jackfruit branches and leaves gently shake. The weather was cool, clear, and very quiet. In the distance, there was the sound of people laughing and calling each other to go to the fields to harvest rice. Every once in a while, the wind blows from the window to where I sit so peacefully. Mom was standing in the middle of the yard drying clothes, while Dad carried the knife out to the bamboo bush. As soon as he took the first stab at the knife, he lay down, his eyes wide open, convulsing. Mother shouted, "Grandpa, what's wrong with you? Save my husband." Dad was in the hospital for more than a month when the doctor shook his head and sent him away. Mother sat down in pain on the bed where Father lay and cried. Many people came in and out to visit and comfort him, but Dad was still the same. After 3 months, my mother swallowed her tears and bought a box to wait for her father to die. Yet Dad didn't die. The day Dad woke up, the weather had started to get cold. The first winds of the season rush in and chirp at the side of the house. That day, my mother was weeding the backyard, and Ngan sat on the bed, hanging her beak out the window, babbling, "Mom, Mom, Mom." I held 2 sticks and tapped them together, pretending to fight like a runaway. As for Kwang, he was lying on the bed. It's been 3 months since Dad fell ill, but my brother still hasn't calmed down. Every night when I sleep, I have nightmares and fear, crying and not being able to sleep. It suddenly rained without warning. Mom quickly took the conical hat that had a few raindrops on it and ran into the house, just as Dad breathed heavily as if his soul had just entered his body, and sat up, put on his slippers, stood up and walked around the house as if nothing had ever happened. Mother was so surprised and happy that she couldn't say a word and hugged her father, crying like rain. My whole family laughed and cried, embracing each other. That night, many people came to my house. Uncle Tuan laughed and talked non-stop and asked a few young men in the neighborhood to carry the box that my mother bought for my father to die and return it to people while it was still pouring rain. Sitting around the tea kettle, Dad said, "I just slashed the knife into the bamboo stump and then fell down. My soul floated out, looking at my body and everyone else's." What is that? To be more precise, the soul escapes the body. I don't understand this very well. I only know that I can fly, but my body is tied to my soul with an almost invisible transparent rope. I held the invisible rope and swung it close to the body and tried to enter, but couldn't. I was so scared that I didn't understand what was happening to me. I kept floating and didn't dare to go far in case I got lost and didn't know my way back. After 3 days, someone came to take me away. This person was dressed like a mandarin, with armor like an old uniform, and in his hand was a very long rattan whip. That person came and unlocked the lock, removed the rope tying my body and soul together, and dragged me away. When I got close to the big river, this person took the rope off me and pushed me forward, saying, "Go, cross that bridge and all suffering will disappear." Dad picked up the cup of tea, drank it all in one gulp, then continued. "The river is very big, the water flows like a waterfall. From this side of the river, looking to the other side, there are only a few undulating mountains." The feeling at that time was very strange. It was somehow refreshing and relaxing. The air was fresh and hazy like standing on a cloud. I listened to him and walked towards the bridge. At the foot of the bridge, there is a very large old tree with beautiful bright yellow leaves. The tree stump is so big that even a dozen adults cannot hug it. At this time, a lot of people like me were slowly moving around. I didn't know anything and just lined up and followed them forward. About 5 meters away from reaching the tree, another official came and gave me bright white clothes and told me, "If you cross the bridge, wear it to be marked as a person of the underworld." "What is Hades?" When I asked, he grumbled and replied, "It's death. No matter how many times I explain it to you guys, I understand." I wanted to ask more carefully, but in a moment he had disappeared. I turned to the people standing next to me to ask. But it's strange that when I ask, people don't hear me, but I hear them laughing and talking to each other. I was confused and didn't understand what was going on when an official came to me and said, "This guy isn't dead yet. Who brought him here? Go out to that trail and find your way back." As he spoke, he pointed his finger in the distance near the edge of the forest and pushed me out of line. As soon as I was pushed out of line, the transparent rope connected to my body became more visible. As I walked near the edge of the forest, I looked back at the bridge and saw nothing there anymore, only eucalyptus tree stumps connected together in long rows. At this time, I kept holding on to the rope and following the Mandarin trail just to get home when I met a very handsome old man. He looked at me and smiled and said, "If you walked across the bridge, you would have died." Luckily, an officer holding a book of life and death on patrol happened to see it. "If you had walked across the bridge, you would have died." When the old man said that, I thought he was a far-sighted person, so he asked, "Let me ask you something. Why are you here? How can I get my body back?" The old man slowly nodded, listening to the questions, then raised his hand to stroke his silvery beard and smiled benevolently. "I don't know why you're here. There are many reasons. Most of the time they die, but looking at you, that's probably not the case. Or maybe some devil pulled his soul out. You have to research this question yourself to get the answer. As for the question of whether you'll find your body or not, it's very simple, just follow the rope home." But wanting to return to his body is not a simple matter. There are people who float for decades, watching their bodies grow old and die. While sitting and listening to the old man talk, I saw a person running down the trail towards me. Right behind, there was a Mandarin running behind and whipping a rattan whip at that person. The person let out a painful cry and then melted into thin air and disappeared. The old man had probably witnessed that scene many times, so it wasn't surprising. He stroked his beard, looked in that direction and said, "You guys are dead, but still lingering in the world, so you ran away. One whip from an official will cause your soul to be completely destroyed. You will have to practice for dozens of lifetimes to become a human again." I was about to ask a few more questions, but the old man had disappeared. I followed the rope for 3 months to get back to my body. I just got back last night. On the road, being harassed by demons, it was very difficult. I was able to return home, but I couldn't get back into my body. Last night, when I got home, I saw my wife and children screaming for everyone. But does everyone know why? While I was screaming and calling, my deceased family members suddenly appeared behind the window and kept putting their hands to their mouths to signal me to stop crying. Especially my grandmother, sometimes standing at the head of the bed, sometimes behind the window, sometimes looming forever at the end of the alley, shaking her head to signal me to stop crying and then gradually walking away towards the grave. At that time, I didn't understand what she was trying to tell me. I was about to run after her and call her when I saw my father under the jackfruit tree. With a panicked look on his face, he pointed out to the bamboo bush and quickly disappeared. I looked in the direction my father was pointing. Tonight the moon is very bright, the sky will be cold, the wind is blowing strongly, making the bamboo bushes rustle in a familiar sound. I gently walked towards the bamboo base and saw something black looming at the top. I knew it wasn't a good thing and was about to go back into the house to think about it and gradually learn about it later, when suddenly the Ngan in the house started crying. The sound of her squirming and twisting her body in discomfort or something made her burst out. As soon as I heard the cry, the thing on the bamboo branch woke up. It raised its ears to the sky as if to determine the location of the cry. It jumped from the bamboo bush onto my roof and then crawled like it was dragging something. I tried to walk closer to it to see what it was that made my deceased ancestors so afraid of it. When I got closer to it, I tried to scream because it was really scary. I didn't know how to describe it because it was actually exactly like what Kwang and Tao saw. The only thing I was better than them was that I took the initiative to learn about it. It turned upside down, revealing its dark, wrinkled belly to the sky. The very long breast hanging over both sides was dragged on the tiled roof and then rolled along the downward slope of the roof, nearly touching my face. It reached out its white hand with black claws to grope for the breast that was dragging on the roof. It seemed like it was most comfortable in a crawling position like that, because when it tried to stand up, I saw its neck fall to one side, exposing all its bones. Then he grimaced in pain and raised his hand to stroke his head. As for its face, how should I describe it? I don't know how to describe it because it's actually very crumpled. This part is in the position of another part, only the mouth is in its right place. After a few minutes, he raised his hand to wipe away the drool that had flowed down his chin and then bared his teeth, leaving only a few yellowed teeth. It stood there for a while waiting for the cry, but it didn't hear it anymore. It transformed again by falling backwards, then jumped onto the highest bamboo branch and curled up to sleep. It was still pouring rain outside, and the wind was whistling on the porch, sounding strangely joyful. Dad stopped talking and looked aimlessly out into the yard, where it was still pitch black. With his hands curled up to make a pipe tobacco, his father stood up, lit incense sticks on the ancestral altar, and continued. After that thing curled up and fell asleep, I went to find my grandmother and father. I walked slowly around the alley to look for it, but couldn't find it. I ventured out to the grave. On the way there, I met many familiar people. I met Mr. Ban standing at the entrance of his house. He looked at me and said, "When you met my family, they said they sent me a few packs of cigarettes. I wanted them so much I couldn't sleep." I met little Hong sitting hugging his cold pillow under Mrs. Hai's phoenix tree. I asked him why he was sitting here and not coming into the house. It says, "My family recently adopted a very fierce dog. The dog bit me and died, so I was afraid to enter the house. When I met my family, I told them not to keep dogs anymore. I was so scared. I see that life in the underworld is no different from our earthly life. When I got close to the grave, I panicked and tried to run away. Does anyone know who I met? I met Ms. After 4.5 days of death, the body surfaced in that water hyacinth patch. It's terrible, when she died, she became a ghost just like that. I thought about going back, but when I saw her crying and looking for something, I took the risk and walked past. Seeing me, she ran back and said, "Young man, please help me find it." "What are you looking for?" I looked for my eyes. I didn't know where I fell, but now I can't find them. If I die here, it will probably fall here. I was about to answer when there was a voice behind me, the voice of Mr. Ton, Mrs. Thoa's husband. As he spoke, my father pointed toward Mrs. Thoa, who was sitting near the door of my house. Hearing her father talk about her husband, she burst into tears. He died not long ago, probably just over a year. Hearing her father say that, she suddenly asked, "Did my grandfather say anything, Uncle? Are you lacking anything, Uncle?" "No, ma'am, he is more beautiful than when he was alive on this earth. He asked me to tell you that he lacks nothing." Then my father continued the story. Mr. Ton's voice said behind him, "Leave him alone, he stands here every day, thanks to this or that person. Sometimes, thanks to the mistake, people are still alive, scaring people to the point of death. But why are you here?" Hearing him ask that, I told him the story of my experience. After listening to my story, he shook his head and said, "You know, that elf lives right in your homeland. Now, how can you believe it when you say it doesn't harm anyone? So how dare your family go home? Poor your father, he was afraid he would take your son away, but he missed you. I just saw him retreating around the grave. Go there and see and find a way to deal with that elf. Where did he come from? He made this ghost town, and no one dares to say anything." I thanked him and then went deeper into the tomb. A few acquaintances saw me and ran over to ask for a few favors. As for the anonymous people who have no one to worship, they run after them and ask for something to eat. I stayed behind to listen to each person's wishes, and then went straight to my home's grave. About 5 meters from the grave, I met my dead relatives. I hugged them and cried. That night I stayed up all night with my family to talk about the past and the future. But the underworld is not exactly like what we mortals think. I asked my father about a few relatives who had died, but I didn't see them here. Then my father said, "The underworld has very strict rules. Once identified as a person of the underworld, they must go through a filtering stage. Like Dad and everyone here are waiting for their turn to read names to go to a place called purgatory. Purgatory is to endure the pain of penance. If you do anything wrong while you are alive, it is all written in the book. Light punishment will result in light punishment. Severe punishment will result in going to hell. After paying for your sins, you will go to a place called eternity." So why hasn't that thing in the bamboo bush gone yet? Those who die unjustly or have too much hatred for the earthly world will be given more time. There are also people who have cultivated themselves into human form without having to go through the penance step. What is it, Dad? I don't know this exactly. I just went to find out some high-ranking people in other places and got the same answer. That thing that lives in its own land has been cultivated to perfection. How can I practice, Dad? It absorbs the vitality of people, animals, or flowers and branches to cultivate. If you suck the vitality of humans or animals, you will become evil. If you absorb the vitality of all plants and trees, you will become good essence. So why don't we all absorb life energy when we die and refine it into essence to avoid having to pay for our sins? This is in the underworld law, and if you are caught, you will be severely punished. What is tin? I rarely hear about it. It has the shape of human flesh, but it can be invisible to whoever sees it and can capture whoever's soul it wants. So the people of the underworld don't do anything? No one dared to report it to the authorities for fear of being implicated, because in fact it did not harm anyone. He came to the land where he lived to find his child. But my Ngan was born on the same birthday as her child. One time, my dad spied on it and saw it sucking the vitality of the bamboo tree on the side of our house to survive. Maybe it's because I used a knife to chop its food that I got punished like that. Sitting and chatting with relatives, the sky was starting to get light. There are a few people still alive on Earth who go to the fields to visit the rice fields. I borrowed paper and pen and made a request for someone to send the officer to take the elf away. I was sitting down to write an application when the string connecting my soul to my body jerked really hard, pulling me backwards, causing the paper and pen to be thrown into the sky. I just had time to grab the pen and scream for my dad. I don't know what was pulling me away. I only know that I felt like I was being sucked really hard towards the body. Then quickly I returned to my body. Dad's story ended when the rain completely stopped. Everyone turned around and told each other to walk quietly and leave. It was still dark outside, and every now and then a few flashes of lightning lit up the sky. That night the whole family hugged each other and slept soundly. Early in the morning, the next day, dew still lingered on small bamboo branches and fell into the pond. The weather is cold, but the sunrise is still very bright. My father woke up early, lit 3 incense sticks, took them out to a bamboo tree, planted them, and mumbled a prayer for something. The incense was burning and smoke spread into the air before it suddenly went out. Dad was confused and didn't know what was going on. There were a lot of people coming to the house from the alley. There are acquaintances, there are strangers, there are people in the village, people from neighboring villages, and even people who introduced themselves from the province. The rumors spread further and further, and more people came to look for Dad. They rumored that he could communicate with the dead, and even had magical powers to transform back and forth between yin and yang. Someone brought a tray full of 5 fruits and knelt at the entrance of my house and bowed from the alley all the way into the yard to ask my father for help. Dad had to try his best to explain to people that he didn't see ghosts, nor did he have yin and yang eyes like the rumors said. In those cases, typically there was a girl in a shiny car parked at the beginning of the village. Looking at the general, he was definitely a very rich man. She walked straight into my house and threw a thick pile of money on the table. "You went to find my husband and asked him to help me where he hid the gold. He died unexpectedly, and now the 3,000 gold bars are nowhere to be found. Please help me, and I will reward you with 200 trees." In the first days, Dad still smiled and tried to explain to people, but later he became upset and made the gate at the beginning of the alley no longer let anyone in or out. A few days after the incident, my father woke up and the weather was stormy again. Every family gathered rice in sacks and stored them high up, afraid of flooding and getting them all wet. My family was very poor back then. It must be said that they were absolutely poor. The house has nothing of value except 2 wooden beds and a table that has been mostly eaten by termites. That night, thunder and lightning flashed brightly in the sky. In that split second, seeing everything clearly as if it were daytime, I saw the jackfruit tree in front of the house struggling to catch every drop of rain to protect the children crowded under it. Baby Ngan lay in her mother's lap, sucking on her nipple, but every time lightning exploded, she dropped her nipple and burst into tears. My whole family was very scared at that time, especially my mother. When he cried, she would hold the pacifier and put it in his mouth. The whole family remained silent, looking at each other and waiting, but nothing strange happened. It was still dark outside, the sound of the rain was still heavy, and the wind from time to time rushed through the crack of the door to enter the house, sending chills down my spine. My whole family huddled together on one bed. The steady sound of rain falling on the tiled roof is like a soothing lullaby. Bang bang. This thunderclap was so loud, my mother quickly raised her hand and pressed it to Ngan's ear. But Mother's hand was not strong enough to stop the thunderbolt. It burst into tears. The roof tiles suddenly fell to the floor and shattered, one after another, causing a big hole in the house. Torrential rain poured into that hole, making it wet. Dad jumped up and sat up, looking for a flashlight to examine the situation. Ngan was still crying. Mom still put the nipple in his mouth, but he seemed full. He reached out to push the nipple away and shook his head and cried. Under the faint flashlight light, Dad trembled and gingerly walked step by step closer to the hole. Just then my mother screamed, "Oh, Mom!" I understood why Mom screamed like that, because she was the only person in the house who hadn't seen her. The dark woman poked her head from the roof down into the hole. The rain poured loudly through the hole, making her head soaked, rainwater flowing through her hair into a stream. My father ran back to my mother and tried to put his hand over Ngan's mouth. But it seemed like it was wrong. The more he covered it, the louder he cried. The more Ngan cried, the more frantic she became. She turned over the tiles and threw them carelessly on the ground, then moved her hands back and forth as if to find something to use as a handhold to jump down. The lightning flashed brightly, seeing that horror more clearly than ever. She had her arms and legs crisscrossed on the tile frame, upside down with her head dangling down and swinging back and forth. She originally had no eyes, so she always had to scrunch her nose as if sniffing. Rainwater flowed down Dad's disheveled face, gathering all the dirty things, flowing down his crooked chin like drool. Her two breasts were lying somewhere on the roof. Her skin was already dark, and now standing in the rain, it looked even more flabby and dirty. She found the pillar. She was about to jump down. She swung her twisted feet, one toe curled over the other, then gathered momentum to prepare to jump. Just as she jumped down, it was as if something stopped her. She quickly jerked her legs up as if she had just touched a fire, then quickly climbed back up to the roof and howled in pain. She angrily ran across the tile roof, frantically continuing to flip the tiles, and then put her hand down and waved it back and forth. "Son, are you hungry? Please give me some. Where are you?" It was still raining heavily outside, the sound of the rain mingling with her voice. My father was very strange at that time. He seemed to have discovered something, smiled, and said loudly, "They are my children. They cry because they are afraid of you, but they are not hungry. I know you're looking for your child, but this is my child, not yours." Hearing her father's voice, she was very surprised. She sat curled up on the tile roof. Under the light of lightning, she looked strangely lonely and pitiful. She cried bitterly and said nothing. Dad continued, "I know you are a good person. Go back to where you should go. In this world, you have suffered a lot." She raised her hand to support her head, which was lying on her knees, then turned towards her father and said, "I love you so much. Don't let me cry." As soon as she finished speaking, there was a deafening roar of lightning. Everything was silent. My whole family was silent, waiting. The rain suddenly stopped. I was so tired that I fell asleep without knowing it. Just know that when you wake up, it will be morning. The sky was beautiful that morning, gentle and clear. What our grandparents said was right: after the rain the sun shines again. My whole family opened the door and walked out together. Outside, bricks and tiles overlap each other like a battlefield. Last night's bamboo bush was burned completely black by lightning. At night, the whole family sat around eating dinner after a tiring day of cleaning. Mom turned to Dad and asked, "Why did she quickly jump back up when she jumped into my house and screamed like she was in so much pain?" The devil cannot enter another person's house without being invited. My whole family was silent. I find her no longer scary, but more pitiful. If I had become a mother that day and was old enough like I am now, I would definitely run back and hug her to comfort her. From the day the bamboo bush burned black until now. Where is she? Run out of.